Hello and welcome back, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed our earlier sessions in German, French, and English. We would like to start the second half of the last day of the News Impact Summit on audience by thanking our sponsor and partner, the Google News Initiative, for making these summits possible. Thank you so much. Now, you are all invited to join our panel on justice and journalism. What can journalists learn from activists and organizers? We thought this was a much needed discussion at a summit dedicated to thinking about how we put audience first. Here it is Adam Thomas, here at the studio, our director at the EGC, who will be moderating this conversation. So hi, Adam from Spain. Welcome, and shall we introduce our panelists?
Yeah, let's get started, Angela. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Thomas. I'm the director of the European Journalism Centre, and I'm very excited to welcome you to this panel, Justice and Journalism. What can journalists learn from activists? And it's been a really interesting year because media has been reckoning with its own diversity struggles now for a very long time. But these really came to the fore this year with obviously the coronavirus pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And during both, we saw that community organizers and other information networks really used their access and their proximity to respond to gaps that communities had in accessing news and information. The EJC published a series of resilience reports looking at news organizations across Europe doing similar things. And we saw that journalists have been employing new strategies and tactics borrowed from activists and community organizers, which really have led to a lot of brand new, really interesting community-first solutions. So in this session, we're going to ask ourselves, what can journalists learn from these collaborations, strategies, and tactics? And I have three amazing guests with me. They're going to appear on screen very, very shortly. Celine Seyman is the executive director at Slow Factory. So we're very, very happy to have her join us. With us also is Hannah Ajala, journalist and the founder of We Are Black Journos in the UK. And then we have Rachel Hamada as well, the community organizer at the Bureau Local. So welcome to you all. What I'm gonna do actually is, seeing as the focus of today has been about allowing people to tell their own stories, what I thought I would do is actually ask you all to do the same. So maybe Celine, we can start with you. I'd love to find out, well, actually, you're working on so much stuff, so I'd love to find out what's a really big priority for you right now. But also maybe you can give us some of your backstory, because I think you have a really, really interesting set of experiences that's led you to this point today. So if you wouldn't mind, Celine, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your work.
Thank you so much, Adam, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Hannah and Rachel. It's an honor to be here with you. So a little bit about me. I co-founded a non-for-profit called Slow Factory that works at the intersection of social and climate justice, or human rights and environmental justice. And we've been doing that since 2012, working at the intersection of the two, if you will, disciplines, because environmental justice is a human rights issue, and we've advocated and worked relentlessly in making that point when it comes to the war in Syria, or the uprising in the Middle East, or the uprising here in the United States, and whether it's with the uprising with Black Lives Matter, or the young children walking out of their schools for their future. And so creating a relationship between environmental justice and human rights, or racial justice, has been a passion of ours for a very long time. Prior to 2012, my background, I'm a Lebanese person. I escaped the war in Lebanon in the 80s. I arrived on a refugee status in Canada, and then went back to Lebanon when the war ended in 1995 or 1996, and just witnessing the destruction the war had on my country, both from an environmental and a human rights perspective, has marked me for my career. And I've since then been very vocal, very active in finding ways to restore restorative justice, and ways in working with the environment as the heart of our solutions, but not from a top-down perspective, not from a colonial perspective, but more from a grassroots perspective, up bottom-up perspectives, and that comes by sharing knowledge, and that comes by empowering open education and empowering the powerful movement that is built around revolutions, which is around education, but reclaiming our own education, unlearning and sharing information that isn't necessarily the ones that we have seen in our institutions. So that's what we do at Slow Factory. We work a lot on open education, on information, and the intersection of human rights and environmental justice.
Amazing. See, I'm now very, very glad that I didn't try and introduce the work you did, because you do a lot more job than me, and you're doing so much stuff, and I'm really excited to get and dig into some of that later. Hannah, I'd like to pass over to you now, and maybe you can tell us a bit about your work, both as a journalist, of course, but also the work that you're doing for We Are Black Journos, and I'm also really interested in the mentorship work that you've been doing for a number of years too.
Yeah, absolutely. And a massive thank you for having me on board with the wonderful Celine and Rachel. But yeah, I am Hannah Ajala. I have been a journalist for the past, I would say 7 or 8 years. But for the past 6 years, I've mostly been working at the British Broadcasting Corporation, or as I like to nickname it, the Beeb. And that is literally what molded me into becoming the journalist that I am, to learn about incredible stories and people doing great things. I wouldn't necessarily put myself in a category, but I'm just really big on challenging stereotypes, specifically about and around marginalized communities. So I founded We Are Black Journos about 2 years ago, when working in a certain department of the Beeb that were broadcasting predominantly to countries around the world where English wasn't their first language. And I'm a big believer in this quote. You're going to hear me say a lot of quotes, by the way, during this, but I believe that media can't reflect society. Society is not reflected in the media. And if you were to look in that particular department and see the background, or just see, like literally just walking in and seeing the people that were creating these these bits of journalism, shall I say, for these international audiences, you would be shocked. And I had to sit down with the editor and, just quite blankly said, isn't it a bit embarrassing? Don't you find it a bit cringe knowing that, you're speaking to international audiences, but that isn't reflective in this organization? And I'm very much so aware that that's a big issue in the Beeb. And I thought, okay, if I can't see that in here, I'll create one outside. So that's where We Are Black Journos came about. It came from, again, the things that I didn't see, and also being fortunate enough to utilize social media very well, in the sense that I was connecting with Black journalists everywhere, to the point that I knew Black journalists that worked at Vogue, New Statesman, all of these, different organizations that don't necessarily do the whole inclusion and diversity thing quite well. And I built the social media page. A lot of people were getting in contact and just following us on our work, which is amazing. And then we had the launch, which I'll be very honest about. Someone that's starting something quite new for the first time, I was a bit worried that not a lot of people would get it. But I would say since the launch, we've had so much support, which has been so warming. So essentially, is to build the visibility of Black journalists, is to build a safe space in our events. We're able to, speak with each other, learn from one another, network, be in the know of certain opportunities. And I guess we're sort of in a later stage of it now, where we're learning about the importance of allyship, especially in such a year like this, where racism has been a global talking point, and being fortunate enough to, partner with organizations like the Bureau of Investigative Journalists, hey Rachel, which has been so warming and awesome. So I'm really, really excited to see where it grows and moves further into. But essentially, it started as just a representation of the things that I didn't see and wanted to see.
Great. Well, there's a huge lesson for us all there in how to effect change, and we're going to dig into some of that later in terms of strategies and tactics. It's been amazing to watch from the outside how that community has gone from strength to strength, Hannah. So it's really fantastic. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from you in a bit. And now, last but not least, I want to come to Rachel, who is a community organizer at the Bureau Local. Rachel, you've been doing and living this work now for the best part of 2 decades, I think, across a number of different organizations. So there are very few people who I talk to who are as experienced in this space as you, but you're always working on something new as well. What are you working on right now? And also a bit of your backstory. How did you get to this point in your career?
Well, I'm going to just have to point out that I started this work aged 8, so I'm not nearly as old as Adam's painting me there. No, I guess I've been doing this for a while. But I suppose one of the really important things to recognise in this, and I'm really, really glad that European Journalism Centre has kind of prioritised this conversation as part of this kind of event. I'm really, really glad to join this session with Celine and with Hannah. But I guess what I want to say is that I'm still kind of learning a lot of new stuff constantly, despite having been in this business for, probably 2 decades or something. And also unlearning, as has already been referred to, having to unlearn quite a lot of stuff. So, I mean, the Bureau Local, the team I'm currently part of, is quite an exciting project because we're still quite little. We're only 3 years old, and we're a collaborative network. We work with lots of different members. We're very much embedded in communities, from how we find stories in the first place through to how we do the storytelling. So that's really, really exciting. But, you know, even within our team, we have a lot of learning to do. In the wider organization, we have a lot of learning to do. So I guess I'll kind of come to the specifics of some of our projects maybe a bit later on in the panel. Then there's definitely some relevant stuff. But I guess I thought it'd be quite useful just to dig a little bit into 2020 and the weirdness that it has been, and kind of what are some of the things that we have been learning along the way as part of that. So I guess kind of on that basis, 2020 has both been kind of very fearful and very freeing. And one of the big things with COVID was that it did show a massive chasm in kind of outcomes for different people, depending on the background that they come from. So folk that were already very exposed were made a lot more vulnerable. So people like insecure workers, people who are in overcrowded housing, people with poor health because of poverty or other reasons, people in the US, for example, without health cover, people losing jobs or income or going further into debt. And one of the really notable things that's been part of this kind of atmosphere of fear has been a lack of reliable information, or rather than a lack, sometimes an overload of confusing and contradictory information that's very difficult to make sense of. And there's a very good journalist called Sara Alvarez for Outlier Media in Detroit. She made the point that COVID was a bit of a game changer because it meant that a lot of us that have quite comfortable existences normally suddenly realize what it's like to be devoid of the information that you need for your own kind of health and safety. And that actually gave people quite a powerful insight into what it's like not to have access to the information and knowledge that you need on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's really important that part of that atmosphere of kind of fear or kind of unnervingness has been often a lack of reliable information. And in fact, there's actually been research, I think this was in Stat News, the health publication, saying that local news deserts are even linked to the spread of infectious diseases, because researchers even use local newspapers and local coverage to try and find out what's going on area to area. And then kind of very briefly as well, I think it's also just been incredibly freeing. People have had visions of what things might look like in a more positive environmental way. The economic system has been disrupted, so people have seen how things like community gardening can work, relying more on local businesses, co-ops, mutual aid. And then also the move to digital, I think, has been really amazing for lots of people with kind of disabilities, chronic illnesses, people who've been pushing for these kind of changes in accessibility for so long. And suddenly that's now possible. And I think that's a game changer too. Obviously, Black Lives Matter has also been a really, really hugely catalyzing moment for society. And again, people have been telling us some of these things for years, but now suddenly it's kind of come much more through to the mainstream. And I think there's a lot of places that can potentially be taken, especially in the media and in how the media operates. So I guess I just kind of wanted to acknowledge what a kind of weird and wonderful year it had been. And as part of this year, actually, we are taking on some new focuses at work, which include looking both at health inequality in much more depth, and also kind of insecure employment and the future of work, which I think are going to be huge issues kind of in the next wee while.
Great, amazing. Thanks, Rachel. Like, as I said, you're doing so much stuff, and I'm really excited to dig into some of this later with you. And I think especially that topic of health is just so fascinating at the moment. I wrote an article about this back in March or April, I think it was, about how everything now is basically the health beat, whether it's economics, whether it's politics, whether it's sports, it is all the health beat. So we're definitely going to come back to that. But before we really dig into, let's say, the tactical kind of nuts and bolts and the takeaways that all the journalists watching can learn from this, I'd love to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about strategy, if that's all right. Because I was thinking when I was preparing for this panel, and the book that kept coming back to me that I read last year was Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. And it's such a fantastic book, and it really blew me away when I really think about strategy, because it basically says that you shouldn't be thinking about strategy as top down or even bottom up, actually, but an emergent process. And in fact, not even a process, it's really a set of principles. And so like the things that I took away from that book were principles of collaboration, principles of embracing change, principles of being prepared to disrupt the status quo. And it struck me that all three of you in your work are doing that. So I wanted to maybe just dig into the principles of it and just to start to understand, how do you think about justice and change in your work? Because it's often a question that I don't think journalists themselves ask themselves very much. And so I don't want to get necessarily too philosophical right at the beginning, but I thought it might be interesting to start that way. And Celine, maybe I can come back to you if it's okay, because I know it's very clear that you spent a huge amount of time thinking about this. You have sort of manifestos on your website and really amazing calls to action. You have worked personally a huge amount on affecting change inside the fashion industry. And so I was wondering, like, how have you approached such a complex set of like economic and cultural relationships and started thinking about how you wanted to change? You mentioned unlearning in your introduction. So maybe you can just unpack that a little bit more, because what I'm hoping is there are going to be parallels for journalism and things that we can take into our industry too.
Oh, yes, for sure. So thank you so much. It's always great to see what books exist out there that intellectualize what we do in a very empirical and intuitive way. And it gives us the power to keep on going and to add more words into our vocabulary and to be able to be more confident in the work that we are doing. Because, of course, we're oftentimes seen as disruptors of the status quo rather than being seen as innovators of what we want to see for a better tomorrow, for an equitable tomorrow, for a just system that really takes into account the people that are at the very bottom of that system, that are the ones that are being exploited for clout, for culture, for resources, for everything, but that are not the ones that at the center stage of decision making and or the system that benefits them. Around unlearning, it always starts with this idea of challenging the status quo, challenging what we've already learned, and challenging what we haven't learned. And this idea of objectivity, that is a colonial construct that does not exist. There isn't anything that is called objectivity in our human experience, because we are experiencing life from a subjective point of view, from a personal point of view, and to imagine that there is an objectivity is imposing a certain construct that is adopted by the majority, or by at least not the majority, because that is also an illusion, but adopted by the ruling class. And that is what counts as objectivity. And that's what we are defying, because it does not exist. There isn't anything that is objective about what we are talking about. And so, again, journalism had to expand its notions around objectivity, because oftentimes it was to preserve a certain status quo, or certain a top-down or linear model that existed that was called objective. Let's remain objective, but there isn't anything objective about it. In fact, it's purely subjective, and it really betrays the position of the journalist or of the person that is advocating for said objectivity. It just tells you where this person fits in the spectrum of their white privilege, or their spectrum of their power within the structure that already exists. So to be able to talk about these things without any guilt or shame is key in being able to embrace change and embracing innovative solutions and innovative thought leaders and people that are kind of bursting the bubble with their truth and challenging what it means to be objective in today's world. I don't think there is enough. I cannot even say that enough, that objectivity is an illusion. It does not exist. It can't exist. And what it means is that it is imposed by the ruling class or by the ruling culture that accounts for the majority, when in fact it isn't the majority. When we look at the population of the world, it's not the majority. It's just who is ruling at the moment. So those are the things that we like to unpack a lot and talk about, and invite people of color, indigenous wisdom, Black, brown, indigenous folks to discuss from their perspective by elevating them to an international stage and centering their voices, not because it's cool, but because it is important, it is crucial. This is a type of knowledge that has been erased, that has been persecuted, that has been also actively not just erased, but crushed even, if we want, from an international point of view. It's not the fringe, or it's not just your quota of diversity and inclusion. It is an active stand towards anti-racism, and it's an active stand towards anti-colonialist strategies to center the voices of Black, brown, indigenous people worldwide. So that's what we encourage.
Amazing. Thanks, Celine. That's amazing. And Hannah, look, I couldn't help thinking of you while Celine was talking there, because, I know that you think a lot about ideas of representation and community power and justice, of course, but you also work for the BBC, this sort of bastion of impartiality. Do you find that there's a conflict there inside your work, or have you managed to find a way to sometimes make that work when you're thinking about centering the voices of marginalized groups?
Yeah, that's such an interesting one, and it can be quite tricky. I know that many other colleagues have, sort of faced that kind of those frustrations, many of those frustrations that you can often feel where you're in a group where you are the only one. So I did kind of make a bit of a vow to myself, and this has been particularly over the past year. I recently had a meeting with the director of BBC News, and I said, I don't actually feel comfortable working at a part of in the department that is domestic, that's just very UK centric, because I'm already aware of who will predominantly be in those teams. I do know some colleagues that have spoken quite negatively about it. And I already know that I will sort of like be shunned away. And I just think of really random examples, such as, the 10 o'clock news after the death of Kobe Bryant. The clip that was used was not a clip of Kobe Bryant. It was just of another Black basketball player, and just several other incidents, mistaking one Black MP for another. I generally don't feel comfortable working in those environments, and I've been very frank about that. So thankfully, when it does come to me pitching a story that could not necessarily is a race story, but it's a diverse story, shall we say, and there's a likelihood that there will be someone in that space, whether it's an editor, a producer, who has a better background or expertise in it. So when it comes to putting that forward, I get that support. There won't be anyone that I'm with that has to go on Wikipedia to find out who this person looks like or what that is about. So I have kind of made that vow to myself, but that's just because of my background. I genuinely have more of an interest in international affairs and, tapping into marginalized group. I just spent about 8 months in West Africa, where I was working on stories from all across the continent. So that is my niche. But in regards to someone else who has an interest in, UK politics or etc., it may just be a different kettle of fish. I have also been quite transparent with editors, because I'm currently freelancing now. We'll hop back into full-time work at some point. I have spoken to some editors about the work that I'm doing, and I guess essentially offering that help. But I believe it's understanding the true definition and meaning of allyship. It's not just having a chat for 10 minutes and suddenly you've eradicated institutionalized racism. If only it could be that easy, that would be amazing. But unfortunately, it's not. It's understanding that it's a lifelong process. It's looking at your teams and, just really having to understand if everyone looks the same, is from the same background, thinks the same, you're always going to get the same and similar kind of results. So that's what I spoke about the director of BBC News. I'm being very frank and open about this because I told him that I would mention this. And it's just great to know that there have been some initiatives put forward by Black members of staff at the BEEB who are working towards making sure this doesn't happen again, informing non-Black journalists and reporters about, why certain things can actually come across as offensive, and just really educating them as much as possible. I know some people think, gosh, but you're a journalist, you're meant to have world awareness. Why must you be educated about how to, speak and research and understand about people from a different background? But unfortunately, it's the way that it is. The BBC was founded decades and decades ago by a rich white man, and he essentially hired people who looked exactly like him. So it was only until decades and decades later where we had the Maurice Stewart, one of the first Black reporters on BBC News and several others. But I'm at the point now where I'm so thankful to work towards this and work with other amazing organizations that are working with us. But I also want to work further to the point where diversity and inclusion isn't a buzzword or, a keyword or etc. It's a norm, it's a lifestyle. Because again, that famous quote, media can't reflect society if society is not reflected in the media.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. And this leads really nicely, I think, on to Rachel and some of the work that's been happening at the Bureau around this. In a way, I guess, Rachel, you and the team there have had the luxury of, it's a much younger organization than the BBC, so you can sort of build some of these principles in. But of course, you still have to reckon with these, these challenges. And I mean, you were part of an amazing initiative this year with Decolonizing News, of course, and confronting journalism's role in systemic racism. And I just thought some of the recommendations that came out of that project were really fantastic. So I was just wondering, maybe you could just talk a little bit more about how you approach projects at the Bureau and of course at the Bureau Local specifically, where you do most of your work. How do you think about these ideas of systemic bias and institutional bias?
Well, I mean, again, I wouldn't want to claim that we're great experts. We're figuring this stuff out like lots of other people. And I would echo lots of the points that Hannah made. I think that there needs to be like a huge sense of commitment from leadership across the whole organization. This work needs to be kind of mainstreamed. It can't be siloed. It can't be an add-on initiative. I've seen that happening a lot. Other organizations launching kind of diversity call-outs, for example, for journalists to get in touch, and then that happens, and then there's never any follow-up. These things, if anything, they probably make the problem worse, because people think they're putting a stick-in plaster on something, and it makes no difference whatsoever. But I think also critical thinking is really important. So this is where, we have had a dedicated team of people looking at some of this stuff in the organization over the last year or so. And that critical thinking means just thinking really carefully about everything you do, so you don't have kind of unintended consequences. For example, having a mentorship scheme that ends up being a bit kind of top down and a bit colonial, that can be quite patronizing. Instead, can we look at doing kind of two-way learning instead and realize that we need to learn as well, and we need to change our ways and think about things differently. That's one example. Also kind of thinking about how you do recruitment. We've made great strides with recruitment this year, and we are kind of figuring out some quite kind of radical and different ways to approach recruitment so that we do get, the most talented candidates, kind of regardless of previous opportunity that people may have had in their lives. But you do have to be careful because, for example, if you particularly go for candidates from one background, you may then end up just getting all the people who are middle class or have had, the kind of the best income backgrounds, educational opportunities, and so on. So you might be addressing one inequality, but then you're kind of perpetuating another. So I guess it's just thinking very kind of holistically and critically about this stuff. And yeah, we're young, so yeah, we can turn things around quickly. We can improve quickly. We can make a mistake. We can come back from it and try something new. And it's definitely harder in bigger organizations, and it's much harder for staff trying to spearhead these kind of initiatives within larger organizations, sometimes against a background of hostility. I'd also massively recommend, and I'm kind of hoping this is something we can replicate in the UK, but Carla Murphy in the States did a really good bit of research called Leavers, which is why, basically a bit of research all about why journalists of color leave the newsroom, you know, probably around about my age, people kind of mid-career in their kind of late 30s, early 40s, have often just had enough, realized that these newsrooms are not for them for many, many reasons. And they're leaving the industry, and that's a huge problem. So you're ending up with senior management still all being very kind of white and middle class. So she's done some great work identifying the problems in the States and what can be done as a result. And I think we need to do the same thing in the UK, because we really need kind of more of an evidence base to address some of these issues. So yeah, it's as Hannah says, it's kind of a commitment to an ongoing lifetime bit of work. This isn't a kind of a quick solution situation, but just thinking about what the gains are as well, especially in terms of sustainability. If you create a journalistic organization that writes about the things that are relevant to the daily lives of lots of people across your kind of country or region, you do that well, you fulfill information needs, then you're going to make yourself much more vital and necessary anyway, you know, if you're being purely pragmatic. So I guess that's a lot of it. And then there's also just kind of, I guess, learning from projects like there's Media Reparations just launched in the US, which is an amazing project from Free Press. They've just published a great 100-page essay, so it's a good kind of print it out and maybe sit down and read it one about the history of journalism in the US, and how sometimes it's been quite anti-Black. And the LA Times published quite a big piece recently, kind of acknowledging all the systemic issues within their kind of organization and newsroom. So I think all this context stuff is deeply important. This stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we need to acknowledge historical and societal context in the work that we're doing, and actually also in our reporting. I think that's really important.
Great, and we're going to definitely come back to that in a minute for sure. There's an amazing project put out by the Democracy Fund, and they did this DEI wheel, which is a sort of 360 look at all of the types of initiatives that you can think about when it's trying to address some of these from a structural sense, and also some of the pitfalls, some of the things that don't work, like poorly thought through fellowships, which for instance can actually sort of damage causes of diversity, equity and inclusion in the newsroom, because they're sort of short-termist, they don't really function, and then everyone sort of gets bored and you can lose support for the momentum. Hannah, if you don't mind, I thought I'd jump back to you for a second and just with We Are Black Journos, sort of what are the strategies and tactics that you are starting to see working amongst that community now? You talked to us about some, of course, that you've employed at the BBC to sort of get some of your points across, but are there other things that you're seeing that are definitely working in UK newsrooms or amongst journalists of colour in the UK?
Yeah, I would definitely say it's when we first began, because it's been almost 2 years now. We're literally turning 2 next month. So the first year was building the community and building the interest. And I guess just to double check that I wasn't the only one, suddenly thinking these thoughts. I have been very active in networking events, any sort of like journalism related events, Black journalists, etc. I've been heavily involved in all of that. There's loads of WhatsApp groups and etc. I just felt like the only thing that was missing was just, again, that physical impact. And we sort of have a similar structure when we did our physical events. So it'd always be Black journalists on the panel, and they literally are just so transparent with everyone, telling us not only about their background but the highs and lows of the job. And the key question as to why a bigger presence of Black journalists matter if we just look at the shocking statistic of the fact that 0.2% of us actually make up journalism in the UK is wild. It doesn't even seem real, as it's such a tiny statistic. So that has been amazing. And then even following on from that, because we did events every 3 months, thankfully we utilized that as much as possible because around the corner there was a pandemic. And, you know, just people sort of sharing their experiences and simple like how-to stuff, like how do I, you know, knock out that voice in my head, aka imposter syndrome, telling me I don't deserve a seat at the table. And these are questions that they can't really get in any other environment. So I'm really grateful for that the fact that it's been a safe space, the fact that people are contacting us via our mailing list, you know, about opportunities, and we're spreading the word and they're working, etc. And after the whole N-word situation at the BBC, we created a thread of Black journalists that work at the BBC. And even me, myself, has been there for 6 years. I didn't know many of us existed. So again, it's just further pushing that narrative of, you know, visibility. And it was incredible to see that in our second year, it wasn't just Black journalists that were getting involved. There were loads of people from all different backgrounds that were genuinely interested in what we wanted to achieve. And it has just been insane since June this year. I'm very, very grateful to say that we are now partnering with the Bureau of Investigative Journalists, and very recently Time Out magazine and Bloomberg. So that's really huge for us because not only is it partnering and getting our name out there, but it's knowing that these huge organizations also want to, you know, really dig into our community of almost 200 Black journalists, those aspiring, those are unsure but really want to be a journalist, unsure how to, and really want to mentor them and build relationships. And that's literally off their own doing. So we're really big on accountability, checking in every now and then, and just continuing to put the word out there with our really small but amazing team. And seeing those changes is just so warming.
Awesome. Celine, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about Study Hall now, because I think this might be a really interesting point, which is your sort of science-driven, let's say, incubator for fashion. And, you know, I know you've sort of applied some of the principles of community organizing and action into how you're thinking about this. And we've obviously talked a lot about the journalism industry here, but that's sort of working in fashion. And I'm just sort of interested to see how that works. And I wonder if there's anything we can take from that into newsrooms.
Of course. So the Study Hall is a climate summit. It's basically a climate summit that is mainly anchored in the fashion industry, because fashion ranks really, really high in terms of one of the industries that are the most polluting. It's not the second most polluting. That fact has been, not verified, but it is definitely an industry that surpasses the aviation industry, which is already an industry that we all consider a polluting industry. So the climate summit is called Study Hall, and it brings together scientists and activists, artists, designers, and solution makers, basically to address climate issues at a global scale within the fashion industry and beyond, because the fashion industry also is an industry that encompasses 5 or 6 other industries, including agriculture, aviation, manufacturing, production, for not just the fashion industry, but for other industries as well. And so we talk about regenerative agriculture. We talk about also fair wages and living wages and abolishing poverty in the global south. We talk about tracing supply chain all the way to the countries that are being exploited and that are being impoverished, in fact, by the fashion industry. We look at policies, microplastics, Green New Deal, and also, of course, we talk about politics when it comes to these global organizations having their roots in so many different countries, and we talk about hollow companies. Basically, it's a term by Naomi Klein, which essentially builds a whole cult around the logo, and then beyond that logo, beyond that cult, there isn't any traceability when it comes to supply chain. So it's very hard to talk about transparency when it kind of stops at a certain level of trade, and then anything else, it can be traced. And we talk also about child labor within the fashion industry, within the food industry, and how these two industries are very close to one another because they share one common ground, which is the soil. And we talk also about waste, and we have Waste Management, one of the largest waste corporation in the Americas, come talk about waste when it comes to the textile industry and solutions that are, that need to be addressed within that realm. And the U.S. and the global north being characterized as the most wasteful countries when it comes to textile waste. We have tons and tons of textile waste. I don't have the actual data with me now, but at least going out of New York City every year, and those textile waste are being dumped in West Africa, in Ghana, and also Pakistan, in Vietnam. So this is also a form of colonialism when we are looking at waste as an environmental colonialism. To look good, you are donating your clothes, you are refreshing your wardrobe when you're in the global north, but you are clogging up the systems of the global south. Where's the responsibility of the industry? Where's the responsibility of government? And so this is what Study Hall looks at, and centers solutions. So of course we look at the data and we look at the stats, but we also are centering solutions because solutions exist. People are working on solutions daily. Indigenous folks have been talking about this for centuries now, since the first white men arrived to North America and to South America, matter of fact. And so we are looking at solutions from different perspectives. We are also centering the people in the global south managing waste. There are several programs and projects that are working with waste management that aren't set up as waste management, but that are looking at what is happening in Ghana, for instance. And so we are bringing together all these global forces to address solutions, to put the responsibility back on the industry, to address accountability within the fashion industry and beyond. Of course, it's not just the fashion industry's issue. And that's what we do with Study Hall, but it also looks at different things, like, for instance, destigmatizing what waste looks like. Waste is not waste until we decide that it is waste, and then we discard it as such. But when we look at circular systems and regenerative systems that are, systems that have been implemented and understood by indigenous communities, by Eastern communities, by Black, brown communities, these systems that have been mimicking nature are much more sophisticated and innovative, if you will, and they are already embodying circularity, regenerative solutions from the beginning. So they are not linear systems that simply discard items as waste, because that doesn't exist in nature. And so we look at these solutions as well.
Rachel, maybe you could jump in here and talk a little bit, because I think a lot of those topics there that Celine talked about that she's sort of trying to affect change around and raise visibility around are definitely topics that overlap with some of your fascinations and obsessions at the Bureau. You've been covering everything from superbugs through to homelessness. But what's really interesting, and I think for this panel in particular, is sort of the way that you've been doing it. And this kind of, if there was a Venn diagram of community organizing on one side and then journalism on the other, and you all fit in pretty neatly there. So maybe you want to run us through your Change the Story initiative and sort of show how that you are building community power to start addressing these issues and giving agency to the people who are affected most by these issues.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'm almost in the middle of the Venn diagram at the moment, because I'm a community organizer this month and I'm going to be a health and equality reporter next month. So I'm literally straddling, well, not literally straddling, but yeah, covering both worlds professionally. But yeah, the Change the Story project was a really exciting one that we kind of kicked off at the start of this year, before 2020 really kind of got serious, I guess. But the idea was to kind of take stock of our work, but also to kind of take the opportunity to reimagine what local journalism, local news could look like in quite a grassroots way. So I mean, there's even more evidence. There's a new report out just the other day, actually, from the Department of Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, that again underlines that a lack of local news actually leads to a democratic deficit, so that when there is less local news, people are less likely to go and vote, and potentially also get involved in other civic activities. So I mean, that's something that's kind of really worrying for the future of kind of democracy and participation, which is huge. So I guess we wanted to dig down as part of this project into, why are people disengaging with news? We know the economic reasons that the news industry is struggling, but why are people also disengaging with news? And what do they want from it? What would a local news that they want look like? So what we did was we set up an advisory group. First of all, we kind of recruited all around the country, and we found 12 different people from England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, from lots of different backgrounds. So we had everyone from paramedics, theatre makers, artists. We had, I'm trying to remember, people from lots of different backgrounds and parts of the UK anyway. So we had this advisory group, but we also wanted to open it up more to a wider public as well. So we set up a pop-up newsletter called Change the Story that was kind of interactive, and we allowed people opportunities to engage along the way. And we had a kind of a 3 to 4 month process where we were supposed to have workshops all over the UK. We actually ended up having one in Belfast, and then obviously having to move online. But each workshop had a specific focus. So the first one we ran, we basically kind of totally unpacked what is local news, what is local collaborative journalism, why are we doing it, what are the values, what is important about it, what should we be able to do with it, what should we not be able to do. So that it was a real kind of taking everything back to first principles session, which was really, really useful for us. And that ended up leading to the drafting of a manifesto for a People's Newsroom, which is something that we've shared publicly. And that is a kind of a document, a statement of intent, I guess, that we will stand by and, hope that all our collaborators kind of agree with as well in terms of an ethos of working. The second workshop we looked much more at kind of stories and topics, and what do people care about? What do they actually want reported, rather than the kind of ivory tower journalist thing where we get excited by a story and go chasing it down a rabbit hole because that's the thing that we want to do. Instead, listening much more to communities and what they tell us are the important stories and ideas. And that was partly why we've taken on this new strand, looking at insecure employment and kind of the future of work, because that was something that we were told was really, really important to people as a priority. And then the third session we looked at was ways of collaborating. So kind of practically, how can people in different local areas work together? And that could be journalists, community organisers, activists, civically minded people of all sorts. How can a group of people like that come together, agree aims, agree something to look at, and collaborate effectively? And so that allowed us to produce a roadmap for local collaborative news that again is published. All the stuff is kind of open source. So that's kind of really useful as a first principle if anyone's trying to set something up like that themselves. And we've also included in that a ton of resources from other organizations, because again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Lots of people have done brilliant work on this already, and we've linked out to a lot of that stuff within that document as well. So yeah, that's really kind of a very useful set of resources for anyone wanting to do this stuff on a local level. I suppose one of the most kind of sad things that came out of it was we also produced a report where the members of our advisory group went out into their local communities to find people who were generally underserved or underrepresented or misrepresented by the news. And they had kind of quite deep interviews with those people about why they feel the news serves them so badly. And the outcomes of that were, pretty depressing, but pretty necessary reading. But I think the thing that stuck in all our minds the most probably was in one of the cities in Scotland, there was a woman who was from a Muslim background who actually said that what she wanted most of all was for there to be nothing about her and her community in the news, because she was so convinced that anything that was written would be negative, damaging, harmful to her and the people around her, that she would rather have no representation at all than bad and misrepresentation. So I guess it was just an indicator of how poorly some people are served by the media. And I guess it's a sign of the work that needs done to fix some of this damage, I guess, and to start something new and better. And in legacy organizations, again, it is harder. There's a lot more to turn around, but it is happening, and there are ways forward. So again, I think it's about collaboration, speaking to each other and kind of learning from each other what works and what doesn't.
Hannah, we've heard there about a bunch of, let's say, classic tactics that are employed traditionally by, let's say, activists or community organizers to really get close to the communities that they work with and to identify those gaps and those informational needs. That's obviously something you do hugely in your work as well. Like you spend a lot of time thinking about misrepresented audiences or underrepresented audiences. You're definitely someone who I think about as reporting kind of for and with a community rather than about that community. What does that look like in a practical day-to-day sense for you as a journalist? Sort of how are you thinking about building sources and building relationships with those communities and thinking about allowing them to tell their own stories?
Yeah, excellent question. You know what, I would say when I first, started it out and having the confidence, shall I say, to pitch my own stories, I would just put myself in the shoes of that person. Like, British media, for example, has been known for being quite notorious with the headlines, the same headlines that we're seeing again and again. So ensuring that I was not, in the sense, representative of that. And, coming to you as a person, we already identify with something. Forget about my organization for a second, but just more so me, because I'm very grateful to be trusted by editors where I can bring particular stories to the forefront. And a lot of my inspiration can come from social media with people with really incredible stories to share. And I guess, again, just to further challenge stereotypes. So I'll just give you a quick example. There was a point where acid burns was on the rise here in the UK. And I actually found a young Nigerian woman just like myself, who it unfortunately happened to by someone who was actually a friend, but disguised as someone else, followed her home and threw acid in her face. And I was mortified by that story. I became so much even more aware of my surroundings. And I saw several interviews of her on Good Morning Britain and so many other programs. And it was kind of the same thing, even a couple of years later, crying. And obviously really hurt and upset. But I wanted a different spin on that. So as well as having her in my mind, I also came across another makeup artist, a Black female, who specializes in doing makeup for burns survivors. So I thought that would create an incredible piece of journalism. I can already relate with them too. I don't really have to go on a crazy formal tip of, popping an email, but I just slid in the DMs, as I like to say, just sent a DM. And we had some sort of dialogue there, and then it went over to the emails. So I actually count that as something that I'm very grateful for, my own kind of privilege, shall I say, knowing that I won't be looked at sideways because, I'm a Black woman, so are you, we have insecurities, look how we're labeled in some parts of the world, but then also look at how we're empowered. So I wanted it to be an empowerment piece, did really well, millions of people watched it online, and it just brought up that conversation about beauty and embracing it. So I think if it wasn't for having that familiarity, then I probably wouldn't have been able to build that conversation and shed light on those stories. And this is exactly what I said to my editor about why it should work. He, couldn't necessarily relate as an older white man, but he understood how passionate I was about it. I told him a million reasons why it would work, and thankfully it did.
Amazing. That's such a powerful story. I think, Angela, we have some questions in the chat, right? So maybe we can jump into those, and you can share those with our panelists.
Yes, we have one question from Lee Zejong. So Lee has a question and says, are there tools, frameworks that any of the speakers can suggest? Example, I know a Spectrum of Allies used for NGOs to identify potential partners when planning advocacy.
So great. Any tools or frameworks that any of you can suggest? Celine, maybe we come to you.
Okay. I'm
Put
like,
you
I
on the spot, sorry.
So, the Slow Factory puts together something called Open Education, and Open Education are free. It's a free educational series. We have during this first semester over 3,000 students, and we look at these concepts from equity design, designing for justice, whether it's your company or your brand. We look also at cultural appropriation and from the lens of First Nation designers, First Nations designers, and journalists and thinkers, and how Indigenous culture is not a monolith. And this one is happening on Friday at noon EST. And all these classes are free and accessible to all, particularly Black, Brown, Indigenous folks. So definitely tune in. And then part of that, there's definitely different frameworks that we've shared within the Open Education platform that are around sustainability literacy, that really embraces this idea of diversity and inclusion. But of course, we don't address it in that way. We are more interested in looking at anti-racist strategies and structures that companies can adopt, and anti-colonial structures as well. But open education is I think it's a great start in terms of tools.
Yeah, I've been looking at some of the resources that you have there on the site, and there's some really interesting stuff. And I've been trying to think, like, how can we reimagine the newsroom if we based it on some of those principles? And I think we've been really lucky over the last day or so that, or the last couple of days actually, with the conference here, as we've heard from people from First Nations and other backgrounds who've been really giving us some amazing hints on how to address some of these challenges, but also giving us some really practical tips on that. So I urge anyone to go back to the videos and take a look at some of the sessions if you've missed them. Rachel, you said you'd produced a number of kind of open documents, and I think you at the Bureau have been really pioneering kind of an open newsroom approach, with being really open, not just about your journalistic work, but also like the struggles that you're facing internally and some of the changes that you're making. We try and do that here at the EJC, and we've tried to publish as much of that as we can as well. But maybe, do you have any specific resources that either you've produced or that you found have been really useful for you when you think about community organizing and this work?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll refer again to the roadmap that we produce as part of the Change the Story project, because that's quite useful, and also signposts other resources. But a few other things I can think of, Free Press, again, in the US, have this really good toolkit to creating an engaged newsroom. And there's lots of stuff in there which kind of ties together journalism and community organizing in a way that is kind of clear, ethical, effective. I guess all the things that you would want. On our radar as well, here in the UK, they have a really good collaboration toolkit. There's some great stuff out there. It partly depends what you want to do and kind of where your journalism and activism, kind of where you are on the line, I guess. So coming from an investigative journalism background, there's a lot of nervousness around being seen to be doing activism or advocacy per se. But then there's also amazing investigative journalism going on that understands, again, what Celine was saying before, that there isn't kind of one objectivity or one kind of real set of facts. It all depends on interpretation. Press On is great in the States in that regard. Lewis Raven Wallace, their book, The View from Somewhere rather, is fantastic on this, and also the podcast. So I massively recommend that. But yeah, investigative journalists, we tend to like to think that we know the objective truth. Other people are maybe kind of emotional. It was all kind of summed up a bit in Bob Woodward's exchange at the NICAR conference a couple of weeks ago with two women journalists who queried him on Trump and COVID, and should some information have been made available sooner for public safety. And he was defensive, but also he was, clearly coming from a position of kind of old school investigative journalism where, I don't know, some people are taken more seriously than others, I think. And I think we really, really need to unpack all of that. And that is partly what we're doing at the time. I was going to suggest another resource based off that. I can't remember what it was now. But anyway, I massively recommend the View from Somewhere podcast and book. And I think, yeah, as investigative journalists, we need to get much better about unpacking what we're trying to do and why. And and I guess what truth means.
Great, thank you. I think that those all, I mean, there's so many there. Hopefully people can start dropping some links into the chat and we can start collecting some of those, because there's some really fantastic ones, and I've definitely only encountered a few of those. So I'm going to be busy tonight looking up some of those. Hannah, did you have any frameworks or tools that you wanted to sort of recommend to the listeners and the viewers?
I mean, I was just randomly Googling your organization, Celine, which sounds like a really great shout, just in regards to tapping into further ways where, you know, people can be held for, I guess, a greater accountability. I would say, in regards to a community sense, so someone that's literally just like a newbie wanting to learn more, to definitely follow charities that are working towards putting more faces like mine in predominantly white spaces. So Creative Access are amazing. They have almost or over 1,000 trainees that are working all over, not just in journalism, but other industries that sort of link to journalism, like marketing and PR and etc. And just to voluntarily take up mentoring, so you could sort of learn about how to further assist and become a part of that change. Because, you know, it's incredible to get so much recognition, but we're still very much so on that journey of building it and monetizing of particular things. But there are charities and organizations out there that have been doing it for a long time and can offer any tips and advice on how to become a better ally and advocate for those.
Great, thank you. Who do we have in the chat next with a question? Angela, maybe you can read us something out.
Yes, we have Claire Kerautren that is asking for all of you, for Hannah, Celine, and Rachel. When someone feels disheartened by media coverage on their community, how do you usually respond?
Yeah,
Rachel, do you want to grab that one first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's difficult. Being in a relatively small organization, we obviously only have a fairly limited control over how the industry as a whole operates, and some of the kind of power dynamics, and some of the ways in which some communities are poorly reported on. I mean, I'm thinking of examples in the UK at the moment. Our traveller communities quite often are reported on in an extremely hostile, unpleasant and misleading way. I'd say there's also, in the UK press, there's a lot of kind of transphobia and pretty unpleasant reporting and comment pieces that have real life implications for people. So, you know, if I was talking to a member of one of those communities, I would not want to make false promises as an individual that me or my organization couldn't keep, because obviously the wider environment is kind of hostile and corrosive in many ways. But I think if you're in a position to be working with that person and reporting with them, then I think there are ways that you can potentially rebuild trust, at least in your media organization. And the ways of doing that are, you know, usually time intensive. There are things like spending a long time with people, giving them the chance and opportunity to get to know you and trust you, showing that you're not just extractive and going to jump in and out again, putting their safety and well-being first, so that if they tell you something that, you know, reporting on could be damaging to them personally, that you take responsibility for that, and potentially not reporting a story that might be, you know, one that will get you lots of clicks. So I guess, yeah, showing that you're responsible, showing that you're ethical, showing that you will listen deeply, so that you'll listen to people over a number of occasions, that you'll listen to what they're saying on a deeper level rather than necessarily just, you know, the first things that people say. And, you know, ideally, if you're telling the stories of a particular community, try and speak to more than one person. So I think it's important that we treat lived experience as another form of data. You know, you wouldn't take one bit of data necessarily totally on its own. So try and speak to lots of different people and build up a picture. I mean, a good example of that was, I think, PRISM in the US, the people who did the really amazing reporting on the forced sterilization and hysterectomies and detainment centers there. And they were horrendous stories. And part of that came from a whistleblower, but part of that also came from spending really, really good time listening and talking to migrant women who were being affected or have been around that situation. And that reporting is difficult, it's challenging, it takes time, and it's really, really not easy, which is why lots of people don't do it. But yeah, I would suggest that is how you go about building trust, but the others might well have other good ideas too. That I feel like there's probably more.
Right, I think building trust is obviously at the core of that, and at the core of a huge amount of the discussions that we've been having over the last 3 days. We are almost out of time, but Celine, if it's okay with you, I'd love to come back to you just on that final question around how do you sort of engage disenfranchised communities or difficult to reach communities. It's something obviously you've done a lot with in your work. Do you have any sort of tips for us, and especially for journalists and newsrooms, on how they might start to think about embracing those communities and engaging those communities?
I don't know. It's a difficult question because this mainly there isn't a recipe to diversify your audience. You know, it's definitely whoever you have within your organization is going to impact who you are talking to and how you're talking to them. So that if you wish to work with, underserved communities or communities that normally aren't centered, marginalized communities, the global majority, I would say, then you would have to diversify your staff and your newsroom, because otherwise you won't be able to talk to these people, because however you will try to use their words or their tactics or their rhetoric, you will be exposed because you are not from these communities. So it's just so natural. It's so normal. It can't be faked, and you have to be really authentic. I think the public is demanding. The public is much more savvy, much more unapologetic, as they should, and is fed up. And honestly, if you want to talk to people that matter to you, you have to hire people from their communities. Otherwise, it won't work. So it's a tricky question. There isn't any tool. You can take all the open education classes. You can come to all of our study halls. It won't change. You have to pass the mic. You have to decentralize. You have to distribute your power, your wealth. Otherwise, it won't work. It won't work. You will be scrutinized. You will be called out. You will be called in. All the tools, all of the things that the public has developed to try to take power, take back some of the power that has been taken away from them, it will happen to you. The classiest thing, the most educated thing you could do is to step aside and to center other people that haven't had that opportunity, and to not just bring one person as a token, but to bring at least 3-4 people from the same group, because it's not a monolith. One Black person cannot hold all of the Black communities on their shoulder. That's unfair. Just like one white person can't, and just like one Asian person can't, and even Asian is such a blank statement. Who are they? Who is this Asian person? Because I'm Asian also, So I don't think you knew that, but definitely diversify your newsroom, have more diverse people that you don't necessarily agree with, so that you have very heated debate behind the scenes, so you know exactly what to say to the public when it comes to analyzing the situation.
Thanks, Celine. Hannah, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, Celine, I could have just high-fived you on every point, so I'm giving you a virtual high five right there. Another quote of mine that I really love, well, not of mine, but that I like, reads, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And it's really shocking that some people would describe diversity as a box ticking exercise, as a way to sort of look good. But the reason why diversity and inclusion come in hand, because it could influence some sort of positive change or thought. Now, imagine being the only one in a team where there's a particular story coming out, and not everyone is particularly sure of what this one person, this Black person looks like. It's not expecting you. So just as Celine said, we're not a monolith. So I'll use the Kobe Bryant situation that happened where a video of LeBron James was used. I can't tell you the last time I watched a basketball game. But just knowing that I'm very likely to find out more rather than others, that works as an advantage. And it's not putting the pressure on that one person to know it all, but it's just being open with those conversations. We have you, let us utilize you, or if you don't know, you may know someone else as well. So it's more than just, what it looks like, but it's the impact of having that person there. And I'm very confident in saying, no matter how junior that person is, if they were in a group that's editorial team, shall we say, that's distributing a certain news package or item, that can make some sort of change or difference. And I say that from someone who has been physically in these newsrooms for years. Some ideas have been taken on board, some haven't. But when it comes to things that they have, broadcasted on air and have ended up being trending, and people are just tweeting abuse and anger at them, then I think it shows that it makes it worth it having this change in there. Because, this online outrage that I've seen so many times this year from so many different broadcasting organizations, I feel like that could have been prohibited had it been for properly utilizing whoever was in those spaces. And it just justifies that there aren't enough of us in those spaces. Hire someone, intern someone, offer a helping hand, ask a question. I've seen journalists in the building travel 5 floors to find out if this person is this person, or some information, or you're an expert about X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to take it as an offense. I'd rather you ask me than paint a negative and quite silly, ill-informed opinion about something that isn't 100% correct.
Thank you, Hannah. And I'm afraid I have to say thank you to all of you. We are at the end of our time, but I just want to thank you all so much for your time, firstly, for your generosity in your ideas and helping us all out with frameworks and so much more. I urge everybody watching to go and follow these folks on Twitter and take a closer look at the work they're doing. It's really fantastic and super inspirational. So thank you all.